He was a man the world had already condemned. Hours before his execution, he asked for nothing. No food, no freedom, no goodbye. Only one request left his lips. "Let me see the Virgin Mary." The guards thought it was impossible. The priest stayed silent. But in that final hour, something happened in his cell. Something that would bring every witness to tears. Stay with me until the end, because this story will break your heart and heal it at the same time. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's begin. This is the story of Michael Carter, a man whose final hours would prove that miracles still happen in the darkest places on earth. What you're about to hear challenges everything we think we know about justice, redemption, and the power of faith. It's a story that transformed not just one condemned man, but everyone who witnessed what unfolded that October night in 2003. Michael Carter was 34 years old when the judge delivered his final sentence: death by lethal injection. The courtroom fell silent as those words echoed through the air. In the gallery, a woman collapsed. Maria Carter, Michael's mother, had never missed a single day of his trial. She had prayed every morning, clutching the same rosary her own grandmother had given her decades before. But on that day, even her faith seemed to crack under the weight of what she had just heard. The case against Michael had been brutal. He was accused of killing a police officer during a robbery gone wrong. The evidence seemed overwhelming. Witnesses placed him at the scene. His fingerprints were found on the weapon. The prosecution painted him as a cold-blooded killer with no remorse, no conscience, and no hope for redemption. His public defender, overwhelmed and inexperienced, barely mounted a defense. The jury deliberated for only 4 hours before declaring him guilty. But Michael had always maintained his innocence. Even as the bailiff led him away in chains, even as the prison doors slammed shut behind him, even as the years stretched on with no hope of appeal, he never stopped saying the same thing: "I didn't pull that trigger." The truth was, Michael's story had started long before that fatal night. He grew up in the kind of neighborhood where survival meant making choices that would haunt you forever. His mother, Maria, had raised him alone after his father abandoned them when Michael was just 7 years old. She worked 2 jobs, cleaning offices at night and stocking shelves during the day, just to keep a roof over their heads. Every Sunday morning, no matter how tired she was, Maria would wake Michael up for Mass. She would dress him in his only good shirt, comb his hair with water from the kitchen sink, and walk him 6 blocks to St. Augustine's Catholic Church. In her purse, she always carried the same items: a worn leather wallet with exactly enough money for the collection plate, a small bottle of holy water, and a silver medal of the Virgin Mary that had belonged to her grandmother. "Michael," she would whisper to him as they knelt in the wooden pews, "remember that Our Lady never abandons her children. No matter what happens, no matter how dark things get, she is always watching over us." Those words would echo in Michael's mind for years to come, though he didn't know it then. As Michael grew older, the streets called to him louder than his mother's prayers. By 16, he was running with gangs. By 18, he had been arrested 3 times. The neighborhood kids looked up to him. He had money in his pockets, respect on the corners, and a reputation that opened doors and closed others. Maria watched her son slipping away from her, and it broke her heart. She would lie awake at night, listening for his footsteps on the front porch, praying that he would come home safe. She increased her prayers, attending novenas, lighting candles, and begging the Virgin Mary to protect her boy from the dangers that surrounded him. "Please," she would whisper in the empty church after evening Mass, "bring him back to me." But the streets had their own plans for Michael Carter. The night that changed everything happened on a cold Tuesday in March. Michael was 25 years old, desperate for money, and running out of options. A friend had told him about an easy job, a quick score that would solve all his problems. Just walk into the convenience store, grab the cash, and walk out. No one gets hurt. Simple. But nothing about that night was simple. When Michael and his accomplice entered the store, they didn't know that Officer Patrick O'Connor was inside, buying coffee during his patrol break. They didn't know that O'Connor had been on the force for 15 years, that he had a wife and 2 young daughters waiting for him at home, that he was planning to retire in just 3 more years. What happened next would be disputed in courtrooms for months. Michael claimed that his partner, Tommy Rodriguez, panicked when he saw the officer. Michael said he tried to stop Tommy, tried to calm the situation down, tried to prevent what happened next. But the gun went off anyway. Officer Patrick O'Connor died on the floor of that convenience store, his blood mixing with spilled coffee and broken glass. Tommy Rodriguez disappeared that night. He vanished like smoke, leaving Michael to face the consequences alone. When the police found Michael 3 blocks away, still running, still trying to escape the nightmare he had stumbled into, he was covered in the officer's blood. The gun was in a nearby dumpster with Michael's fingerprints all over it. The case seemed open and shut. Michael's trial lasted 2 months, but it felt like a lifetime to Maria. She sat in the same seat every day, clutching her rosary, praying for a miracle that never seemed to come. She watched as witness after witness testified against her son. She listened as the prosecutor described Michael as a dangerous criminal who deserved no mercy, and she prayed. Every night, she knelt beside her bed and begged the Virgin Mary to intervene. She promised to dedicate her life to service. She offered her own life in exchange for her son's. She wept until she had no tears left, and then she wept some more. The guilty verdict hit her like a physical blow. When the judge announced the death sentence, Maria felt something inside her chest break. But even then, even in that moment of absolute despair, she didn't stop praying. Our Lady never abandons her children, she whispered to herself as the courtroom emptied around her. Our Lady never abandons her children. Michael was transferred to death row at the state penitentiary, a fortress of concrete and steel where hope went to die. His cell was 8 feet by 10 feet, containing a narrow bed, a metal toilet, and a small desk bolted to the wall. The walls were painted a sickly green color that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Through his tiny window, he could see nothing but razor wire and guard towers. For the first year, Michael raged against his circumstances. He filed appeal after appeal, each one rejected. He wrote letters to journalists, to civil rights organizations, to anyone who might listen to his story, but no one seemed to care about the truth. As far as the world was concerned, Michael Carter was exactly where he belonged. His mother visited him every week without fail. She would take 3 buses and walk 2 miles to reach the prison, carrying her purse with the same items she had always carried: her worn wallet, her bottle of holy water, and her grandmother's medal of the Virgin Mary. During their visits, they would sit on opposite sides of a thick glass partition, speaking through phones that crackled with static. Maria would tell Michael about her week, about the neighbors, about anything except the countdown that was always ticking in the background. And always, before their time was up, she would pull out her rosary and pray with her son through the glass that separated them. "Hail Mary, full of grace," she would begin, and Michael would join her, their voices creating an echo in the sterile visiting room. As the years passed, something began to change in Michael's heart. The constant visits from his mother, always accompanied by prayer, began to awaken something he thought he had lost forever on the streets. The faith of his childhood, buried under years of anger and poor choices, started to stir again. The prison chaplain, Father Thomas Mackenzie, played a crucial role in this transformation. Father Mackenzie was a 68-year-old Irish priest who had been ministering to condemned men for over 30 years. He had seen every kind of criminal, every type of story, every possible human response to facing death. But there was something about Michael Carter that caught his attention. Father Mackenzie began visiting Michael regularly, not to preach about damnation and judgment, but to talk about forgiveness and redemption. He spoke about how God's mercy was bigger than any mistake, how love could transform even the hardest heart. "Michael," Father Mackenzie would say during their conversations, "God knows the truth even when men fail to find it." Those words planted seeds in Michael's soul that would grow in ways no one could have predicted. By his 5th year on death row, Michael had begun attending the prison chapel services. The small sanctuary was nothing like the grand cathedral of his childhood memories, just a converted storage room with folding chairs and a simple wooden cross mounted on the wall. But within those humble walls, Michael began to rediscover the peace his mother had always tried to show him. He relearned how to pray the rosary, his fingers moving across the beads with the same rhythm his mother had taught him as a boy. The familiar prayers brought him comfort in ways he hadn't expected. Each Hail Mary became a bridge connecting him to the faith he thought he had lost forever. Other inmates began to notice the change in Michael. The rage that had defined his early years on death row gradually gave way to something quieter, deeper. He started helping fellow prisoners write letters to their families. He mediated disputes in the yard. Guards who had once viewed him as a troublemaker began to see something different in his eyes. That Carter boy is not the same man who came through here," one veteran guard remarked to another. "There's something peaceful about him now." But peace couldn't change the reality of his situation. Appeals continued to be denied. Lawyers stopped returning calls. The execution date that had once seemed impossibly distant began to feel very real. During his 7th year in prison, something extraordinary happened that would change the course of Michael's story forever. It was a Tuesday evening in late September. Michael was alone in his cell, praying the rosary that his mother had somehow managed to get approved for him to keep. The prison was unusually quiet that night, with most inmates already settled in for the evening. As Michael held the worn beads between his fingers, reciting the prayers his mother had taught him, the air in his cell seemed to shift. The harsh fluorescent lighting overhead flickered once, then steadied. Michael looked up, thinking there might be an electrical problem, but what he saw made his breath catch in his throat. Standing before him was a woman unlike anyone he had ever seen. She was dressed in flowing robes of the deepest blue, trimmed with white that seemed to glow with its own inner light. Her face was gentle beyond description, with eyes that held both infinite compassion and profound sorrow. She looked at Michael with the kind of love he had only glimpsed in his mother's gaze. "Son," she said, and her voice was like music, like wind through wheat fields, like every lullaby his mother had ever sung to him. "Your mother has never stopped praying for you. Keep praying. The truth always comes to light." Michael blinked, certain he was hallucinating from the stress of his approaching execution date. But when he opened his eyes, she was still there, smiling at him with a tenderness that made his heart ache with recognition. He had seen that face before, on the medal his mother carried, in the stained glass windows of his childhood church, in countless religious paintings and statues. This was the Virgin Mary, the Mother of God, the same lady his mother had prayed to every single day for his protection. "I'm not innocent," Michael whispered, his voice breaking. "I was there that night. I was part of what happened." "Well, innocence and guilt are not always what they appear to be," she replied gently. "Your heart knows the truth. Trust in mercy, and let love guide you through these final days." Michael reached out his hand, wanting to touch the hem of her robe, to confirm that this vision was real. But as his fingers moved through the air, she began to fade like morning mist, her smile the last thing to disappear. The cell returned to its harsh reality. Concrete walls, steel bars, the distant sound of guards making their rounds. But the peace that filled Michael's heart was unlike anything he had ever experienced. For the first time in 8 years, he felt truly free. He told Father Mackenzie about the vision during their next meeting. The old priest listened with the kind of attention he reserved for the most sacred confessions, his weathered hands folded in prayer. "Michael," Father Mackenzie said when the story was finished, "Our Lady appears to those who need her most. She comes to prepare hearts for what lies ahead. Keep praying, my son. Keep your heart open to whatever grace she wants to give you. Michael did exactly that. His prayers became deeper, more constant. He found himself talking to the Virgin Mary as if she were sitting beside him in his cell. He told her about his fears, his regrets, his love for his mother, and his desperate hope that somehow, some way, the truth would finally emerge. But the calendar kept turning its pages, and his execution date grew closer. On October 15th, 2003, the warden delivered the news Michael had been dreading. His sentence was scheduled for October 18th at 6 in the evening. All legal appeals had been exhausted. There would be no more delays, no more hope for intervention from the courts. The news hit him like a physical blow, but strangely, the peace he had felt since his vision remained intact. He spent that day writing letters to his mother, to Father Mackenzie, to the family of Officer O'Connor, expressing his sorrow for their loss, even though he maintained he wasn't the one who pulled the trigger. 2 days before his scheduled execution, Michael received what would be his final visit from his mother. Maria had aged considerably during the 8 years of his imprisonment. Her hair had gone completely gray, her hands shook with arthritis, and she moved with the careful steps of someone whose body was wearing out from years of carrying an impossible burden. But her eyes still held the same fierce love they had always held for her son. She arrived carrying something special wrapped in a soft white cloth. With trembling hands, she unwrapped a small framed image of the Virgin Mary, no larger than the palm of her hand. The frame was simple wood, worn smooth by decades of handling. The image itself was a traditional portrayal of Our Lady, her hands folded in prayer, her eyes gazing heavenward with perfect serenity. This belonged to your great-grandmother," Maria said, her voice thick with emotion. "Then to your grandmother, then to me. I want you to have it with you at the end, so you'll know that Our Lady is there with you." Michael took the small frame and held it against his chest, feeling the weight of generations of faith in his hands. His great-grandmother had carried this image through poverty and hardship. His grandmother had prayed before it through the Great Depression and 2 world wars. His mother had clutched it through every crisis of her adult life, including these 8 years of watching her son face death. "Thank you, Mama," Michael whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you for never giving up on me." They spent their final hour together in prayer, reciting the rosary through the glass partition that separated them. When visiting time ended, Maria pressed her hand against the glass one last time. "Our Lady will be with you," she said. "Remember that, my son. You are not alone." The next morning, October 17th, Warden James Morrison made his customary visit to discuss Michael's final requests. Morrison was a career corrections officer who had overseen dozens of executions during his 20-year tenure. He approached these conversations with professional detachment, having learned long ago that emotional involvement only made an already difficult job impossible. "What would you like for your last meal?" Morrison asked, consulting his clipboard. Michael looked down at the small image of the Virgin Mary in his hands. Since receiving it from his mother, he had not let it out of his sight for a single moment. Something about holding it made him feel connected not just to his family, but to something much larger and more mysterious. "I don't want a special meal, sir," Michael replied quietly. "I only ask that you allow me to keep this image of the Virgin Mary with me until the end." Morrison frowned. In all his years of managing executions, he had never had a condemned man refuse his final meal. Most prisoners requested elaborate spreads, comfort foods from their childhood, or expensive delicacies they had never been able to afford. This request was completely unprecedented. "Are you sure?" Morrison asked. "You can have anything you want. Steak, lobster, your mother's cooking if we can arrange it. This is your last chance." Michael looked directly at the warden, his eyes clear and peaceful. "I'm sure, sir. All I need is her with me." Morrison studied Michael's face, looking for signs of mental breakdown or psychological manipulation. But what he saw was a man who had found a kind of peace that the warden himself had never experienced. Against his better judgment, Morrison found himself moved by the simple faith he witnessed. "All right," the warden agreed. You can keep it with you. That final night, Michael could not sleep. He sat on the edge of his narrow bunk, holding the image of the Virgin Mary, praying the rosary over and over again. The prayers had become as natural as breathing to him now, each bead a step closer to whatever awaited him beyond this life. Around 3 a.m, as the prison settled into its deepest quiet, Michael began reciting a prayer his mother had taught him as a child, words he had not spoken in over 20 years. "Virgin Mary, Mother of God and our Mother," he whispered into the darkness, "intercede for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. You who are the refuge of the afflicted and the consolation of the sorrowful, receive me in your mercy." As the words left his lips, Michael felt a warmth spread through his chest, a sensation of being held and protected that reminded him of falling asleep in his mother's arms when he was small. For the first time since receiving his execution date, he felt ready to face what was coming. But neither Michael nor anyone else in that prison was prepared for what would happen next. In the early hours of that final morning, something occurred that would challenge everything they thought they knew about faith, justice, and the power of prayer. At exactly 3:30 in the morning, night guard Steve Martinez was making his routine security rounds through the death row corridor when something stopped him in his tracks. From Michael Carter's cell came a soft, golden light that seemed to pulse gently like a heartbeat. Martinez had worked the night shift at the prison for 15 years. He had seen everything: attempted suicides, violent outbursts, prisoners having mental breakdowns in the face of their approaching executions, but he had never seen anything like this. The light was coming directly from the small image of the Virgin Mary in Michael's hands. Martinez blinked hard, thinking his tired eyes were playing tricks on him. He had pulled double shifts all week, and exhaustion could make a man see things that weren't there. But when he opened his eyes again, the light was still there, steady and unmistakable. "Carter," Martinez called out, his voice barely above a whisper. "What's going on in there?" Michael looked up from his prayers, his face illuminated by the strange radiance emanating from the small religious image. He was as shocked as the guard, staring down at the picture in wonder and disbelief. "I don't know," Michael replied, his voice filled with awe. "She's glowing." Martinez stepped closer to the cell bars, his hand instinctively reaching for his radio. The light wasn't harsh like the fluorescent bulbs that lined the corridor. It was warm, gentle, almost alive. It pulsed softly, like breathing, and seemed to fill the entire cell with a presence that made the hardened corrections officer feel something he hadn't experienced in years: peace. "This isn't possible," Martinez muttered, pulling out his radio with shaking hands. "Control, this is Martinez on Block 7. I need a supervisor down here immediately." Within minutes, the night supervisor Robert Chen arrived with 2 additional guards. Chen was a no-nonsense administrator who had built his career on following protocols and maintaining order. He approached every situation with cold logic and systematic thinking. But when he saw the light coming from Michael's cell, his methodical worldview cracked. "What kind of trick is this?" Chen demanded, though his voice lacked its usual authority. "Carter, where did you get that thing?" "My mother brought it yesterday," Michael answered softly, still staring at the glowing image. "It belonged to my great-grandmother. It's been in our family for generations." Chen grabbed his flashlight and shined it into the cell, searching for hidden wires, batteries, any rational explanation for what they were witnessing. But the light from the Virgin's image was clearly independent of any external source. It seemed to come from within the picture itself, defying every law of physics Chen understood. "Call the warden," Chen ordered one of the guards. "And nobody talks about this to anyone until we figure out what's happening." Warden Morrison arrived at the prison at 4:15 in the morning, roused from sleep by Chen's urgent phone call. He had dealt with every conceivable crisis during his tenure, from riots to hostage situations to suicide attempts. But as he stood before Michael's cell, watching a religious picture emit its own light, Morrison felt completely out of his depth. "Can get the chaplain," Morrison commanded. "Father Mackenzie needs to see this." Father Mackenzie arrived 30 minutes later, still in his pajamas under a hastily thrown-on coat. The elderly priest had ministered to condemned men for decades, offering comfort in their final hours and witnessing their last confessions. He had seen faith work miracles in human hearts, had watched hardened criminals find peace through prayer. But when Father Mackenzie saw the image of the Virgin Mary glowing in Michael's hands, he immediately dropped to his knees on the cold concrete floor. "Lord, have mercy," the priest whispered, making the sign of the cross. "This is a sign." "A sign of what?" Morrison asked, his voice tight with anxiety. "Our Lady is interceding," Father Mackenzie replied with absolute conviction. "Something extraordinary is about to happen." Word of the miraculous light spread quickly through the prison staff. Some guards requested transfers to other blocks, unnerved by the supernatural occurrence. Others found excuses to walk past Michael's cell, drawn by curiosity and something deeper they couldn't name. The image continued to glow through the early morning hours, its light never wavering, never dimming. Michael sat in quiet prayer, holding the picture against his chest, feeling a presence in his cell that transformed the sterile space into something holy. At 10 o'clock that morning, just 8 hours before his scheduled execution, something even more extraordinary happened. David Walsh, one of the prison's most senior guards, approached Michael's cell during his routine patrol. Walsh was 58 years old and had worked in corrections for 23 years. He was known throughout the facility as a man of few words and fewer emotions. He had supervised dozens of executions, maintaining professional detachment even in the face of human suffering. Other guards respected his ability to remain unmoved by the pleas and tears of condemned men. But when Walsh looked at the glowing image in Michael's hands, something inside him shattered. He began trembling uncontrollably, his weathered face contorting with an anguish that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. Without warning, he collapsed to his knees on the corridor floor, his body racked with sobs. "I can't do this anymore," Walsh cried out, tears streaming down his face. "I can't carry this weight any longer." The other guards stared in shock. In all their years working with Walsh, none of them had ever seen him display emotion. He was the rock of the department, the one who never broke, never bent, never showed weakness. "Walsh, what's wrong?" Morrison demanded, rushing to the scene after hearing the commotion. "I lied," Walsh screamed, his voice echoing through the cell block. "God forgive me. I lied at the trial. Michael Carter is innocent." The silence that followed was deafening. Morrison felt his legs weaken as the implications of Walsh's words sank in. Around them, other guards stood frozen, unable to process what they had just heard. "What are you talking about?" Morrison whispered. Walsh continued sobbing, his words tumbling out between gasps for air. "I was there that night. I saw everything. It wasn't Michael who pulled the trigger. It was Tommy Rodriguez. But Tommy was working as a police informant, and Detective Harris paid me to lie during the trial." Michael clutched the glowing image tighter, barely able to believe what he was hearing. After 8 years of proclaiming his innocence, after watching his appeals fail one by one, the truth was finally emerging in the most unexpected way. I've carried this secret for 8 years, Walsh continued, his voice breaking. "Every night I thought about his mother sitting in that courtroom, crying for her son. But I was scared. Harris threatened me, said terrible things would happen to my family if I ever told the truth." Morrison immediately called the district attorney's office and the public defender who had handled Michael's original case. Within hours, prosecutors and defense attorneys were racing to the prison. Walsh's confession, witnessed by multiple corrections officers, was enough to halt the execution immediately. At 11:30 that morning, just 6.5 hours before Michael was scheduled to die, his execution was officially suspended. Walsh's breakdown triggered a full investigation into the case. Detective Richard Harris, now retired and living in Florida, was brought in for questioning. Under intense interrogation, he eventually admitted to the corruption that had led to Michael's wrongful conviction. Tommy Rodriguez, the real killer, had died 3 years earlier in a car accident in state. But another, the evidence that had been suppressed during the original trial, began to surface. Witness testimonies that had been altered, forensic reports that had been buried, a web of lies that had kept an innocent man on death row for nearly a decade. The small image of the Virgin Mary continued to glow throughout that day, its light serving as a beacon of hope in the darkest corners of the prison. Inmates who had never shown interest in religion found themselves drawn to Michael's cell, standing quietly in the corridor, witnessing something they couldn't explain but somehow understood. Father Mackenzie spent the day with Michael, praying and talking about what was unfolding. The old priest had seen many things in his 40 years of ministry, but nothing had prepared him for this moment when heaven seemed to touch earth in such a tangible way. "Oh, she came for you," Father Mackenzie told Michael as they knelt together in prayer. "Our Lady came into this place of darkness to bring light, not just for you, but for everyone who needed to see her mercy." The investigation moved with unprecedented speed. The district attorney, faced with undeniable evidence of prosecutorial misconduct and perjury, had no choice but to drop all charges against Michael Carter. The state's case collapsed like a house of cards, revealing the corruption that had sent an innocent man to death row. On December 15th, 2003, almost 2 months after his original execution date, Michael walked out of prison a free man. His mother, Maria, was waiting outside the gates, holding the same Virgin Mary medal she had carried every day for 8 years. I told you," she whispered as she embraced her son, tears streaming down both their faces. "Our Lady never abandons her children." The story of Michael Carter's miraculous release spread far beyond the prison walls. News outlets picked up the account of the glowing religious image and the guard's dramatic confession. Legal experts called it one of the most extraordinary cases of wrongful conviction they had ever encountered. But for those who witnessed the events firsthand, the story was about much more than a miscarriage of justice being corrected. It was about the power of faith to transform hearts, about mercy arriving in the most unexpected ways, about a mother's prayers being answered after years of seemingly unanswered pleading. The small image of the Virgin Mary, which had glowed so mysteriously on that final night, was examined by experts who could find no scientific explanation for what had occurred. There were no hidden lights, no chemical reactions, no technological tricks. It was exactly what it appeared to be, a simple religious picture that had somehow become a conduit for something beyond human understanding. Michael used the compensation he received from the state to establish a foundation dedicated to helping other prisoners who had been wrongfully convicted. He spoke at legal conferences about the flaws in the justice system and the importance of never giving up hope, even in the darkest circumstances. Father Mackenzie, who had walked alongside Michael through his entire journey, later said it was the most powerful demonstration of divine intervention he had witnessed in his decades of priesthood. The miracle hadn't just freed an innocent man, he explained. It had also freed the soul of David Walsh from the burden of his lies. David Walsh himself underwent a complete transformation after his confession. The hardened corrections officer, who had carried the weight of his deception for 8 years, became an advocate for criminal justice reform. He testified before legislative committees about the dangers of corruption within law enforcement, and worked tirelessly to ensure that other innocent people wouldn't suffer as Michael had. Maria Carter lived to see her son marry and have children of his own. She passed away peacefully in 2010 at the age of 79, still carrying the same Virgin Mary medal that had sustained her faith through the darkest period of her life. At her funeral, Michael spoke about how his mother's unwavering belief had not only saved his life, but had brought about a miracle that touched everyone who witnessed it. The small, glowing image now sits in a place of honor in Michael's home, a daily reminder of the night when the impossible became possible. He looks at it each morning and remembers the moment when despair transformed into hope, when lies gave way to truth, when the intercession of the Virgin Mary proved that no situation is beyond redemption. This story challenges us to reconsider what we think we know about justice, about faith, about the power of prayer to change not just hearts, but circumstances. It reminds us that miracles still happen, often in the places where we least expect them, for people who need them most. The guards who witnessed the glowing image never forgot what they saw that night. Several of them left corrections work entirely, feeling called to different paths after encountering something that defied rational explanation. Others remained in their positions, but approached their duties with a new understanding of the humanity of the men and women in their care. For Michael Carter, the experience transformed not just his circumstances, but his entire understanding of purpose. He realized that his years of suffering had prepared him for a mission he never could have imagined. The foundation he established went on to help dozens of wrongfully convicted individuals, providing them with legal assistance, emotional support, and most importantly, hope. The case also led to significant reforms in the state's criminal justice system. New protocols were established for handling cases involving police informants. Additional oversight was implemented for prosecutors handling capital cases. While no system could ever be perfect, the changes helped ensure that future Michael Carters would have better protection against the kind of corruption that had nearly cost him his life. But perhaps the most profound impact was on the concept of faith itself. In an age when many people struggle to believe in anything beyond what they can see and touch, the story of the glowing Virgin Mary image offered something different. It provided tangible evidence that there are forces at work in the world that transcend human understanding, that mercy and justice sometimes arrive through channels that science cannot explain. The miracle didn't end with Michael's release from prison. It continued in the changed lives of everyone who encountered his story. Prison guards who had grown cynical about human nature found their faith restored. Lawyers who had become discouraged by systemic injustice discovered renewed passion for their work. Families of other wrongfully convicted individuals found hope where there had been only despair. The Virgin Mary's intervention in that death row cell became a beacon of light that extended far beyond the prison walls, touching lives in ways that continue to ripple outward even today. It stands as a testament to the power of unwavering faith, a mother's love, and the mysterious ways that grace can enter our darkest moments to bring about transformation we never thought possible. The ripple effects of that miraculous night continued to spread through the community like waves from a stone dropped into still water. Word had traveled beyond the prison walls, reaching the family of Officer Patrick O'Connor, the man whose death had sent Michael to death row in the first place. Patricia O'Connor, the officer's widow, had spent 8 years living with the pain of her husband's murder. She had raised their 2 daughters alone, carrying the weight of grief and the bitter satisfaction that at least justice had been served. When news broke about Michael's innocence and the corruption that had framed him, Patricia felt her world turn upside down all over again. The real killer, Tommy Rodriguez, was dead. There would be no justice for her husband now, no closure through the courts. But something unexpected happened when Patricia finally met Michael face to face at a community healing event organized by Father Mackenzie. Standing before the man she had believed killed her husband, Patricia saw something she hadn't expected. She saw her own pain reflected in his eyes. The same loss, the same years of carrying had lost an unbearable burden. Michael, 8 years of his life, his reputation, his freedom. But more than that, he had carried the weight of being blamed for a death he didn't cause, just as she had carried the weight of losing the love of her life. "I'm sorry for your loss," Michael said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know my being innocent doesn't bring your husband back. I know it doesn't take away your pain." Patricia studied his face, searching for signs of deception or manipulation. But what she found was genuine sorrow. not just for his own suffering, but for hers. This man who had been condemned by the world, who had spent nearly a decade on death row, was expressing compassion for her loss. "I hated you for 8 years," she admitted, tears streaming down her face. "I celebrated when you got the death sentence. I counted down the days until your execution." Michael nodded, understanding flooding his features. "You had every right to hate me. Everyone believed I was guilty. I would have hated me too." What happened next surprised everyone present. Patricia reached out and took Michael's hand, her own trembling with emotion. "But you're not the one who took my husband away from me. You're just another victim of the same evil that destroyed my family." The two stood there, united in their grief and their survival, living proof that healing could emerge from even the deepest wounds. Father Mackenzie, watching from nearby, felt tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. This was the continuation of the miracle that had begun with the glowing image. Hearts were being transformed, hatred was giving way to understanding, and grace was working in ways that defied human logic. Detective Harris, the corrupt officer who had orchestrated the cover-up, faced a very different fate. His arrest and subsequent trial became a media sensation, exposing a network of corruption that had been operating within the police department for years. Other cases he had handled came under scrutiny, revealing a pattern of evidence tampering and witness intimidation that had sent multiple innocent people to prison. The investigation revealed that Harris had been taking money from various criminal organizations in exchange for protection and favorable treatment. Tommy Rodriguez had been just one of many informants in his network, criminals who were allowed to continue their illegal activities as long as they provided information that helped Harris build cases against his targets. During his trial, Harris showed no remorse for his actions. He sat stoically as victim after victim testified about lives destroyed by his corruption. When given the chance to speak, he offered only a cold justification for his behavior. "I was protecting the community," Harris claimed. "Sometimes you have to make hard choices to keep dangerous people off the streets." But the judge saw through his self-serving rhetoric. "Detective Harris," she said during sentencing, "you didn't protect anyone. You became the very evil you were sworn to fight against. Your actions didn't just destroy individual lives, they damaged the public's faith in the entire justice system." Harris received a 25-year sentence, which many felt was inadequate given the scope of his crimes. But for Michael, the length of Harris's punishment mattered less than the public vindication of his innocence. After years of being viewed as a cold-blooded killer, his name was finally cleared. The small image of the Virgin Mary continued to hold a special place in Michael's daily life. Every morning, he would spend time in prayer before it, thanking God for his freedom and asking for guidance in how to use his second chance. The picture no longer glowed with supernatural light, but Michael often felt the same sense of peace and presence he had experienced that miraculous night. Visitors would sometimes ask him about the glowing phenomenon, wanting to understand how such a thing could happen. Michael's response was always the same. "I don't know how it happened," he would say with a gentle smile. "I just know that when I needed hope the most, when everything seemed impossible, Our Lady found a way to reach me. That's all that matters." The foundation Michael established grew beyond anything he had initially imagined. What started as a small organization dedicated to helping wrongfully convicted individuals evolved into a comprehensive support system for families affected by criminal justice failures. They provided legal assistance, emotional counseling, financial support, and advocacy services for people who had fallen through the cracks of an imperfect system. One of their first major cases involved a woman named Sandra Martinez, who had spent 12 years in prison for a murder she didn't commit. Like Michael, Sandra had maintained her innocence throughout her trial and imprisonment. Like Michael, she had been failed by an overworked public defender and a system more interested in closing cases than finding truth. When Michael first met Sandra, he saw his own story reflected in her experience. She had been convicted based on the testimony of a single witness whose story had changed multiple times during the investigation. Crucial evidence that might have exonerated her had been lost or overlooked. Her appeals had been denied repeatedly, and she was facing the possibility of dying in prison for someone else's crime. Working with a team of volunteer lawyers, Michael's foundation took on Sandra's case. They hired private investigators to track down witnesses who had never been interviewed during the original investigation. They used new forensic techniques to re-examine evidence from the crime scene. Most importantly, they never gave up hope that the truth would eventually emerge. After 2 years of intensive investigation, they uncovered evidence that not only proved Sandra's innocence, but identified the real killer. A career criminal who had been operating in the same area where the murder occurred had confessed to the crime before his death in another state. His confession had been recorded by police, but had somehow never made it into Sandra's case file. The day Sandra walked out of prison was one of the most emotional moments in Michael's life. Watching her embrace her elderly mother, who had never stopped believing in her daughter's innocence, reminded him of his own reunion with Maria 8 years earlier. The cycle of injustice had been broken for another family, and hope had tried again. Stories over despair, once like Sandra's, became increasingly common as Michael's foundation gained recognition and resources. They helped expose flaws in forensic science that had led to wrongful convictions. They advocated for legal reforms that would prevent future miscarriages of justice. They provided support for families who were fighting to prove their loved ones' innocence. But perhaps their most important work was the simple act of believing. In a system that often treated defendants as guilty until proven innocent, the foundation offered something precious and rare: faith in the possibility that truth would ultimately prevail. Maria Carter lived to see many of these victories. Though her health declined in her final years, she remained actively involved in the foundation's work, often serving as a counselor to other mothers whose children had been wrongfully convicted. Her story of unwavering faith and persistent prayer became an inspiration to families facing similar struggles. "Never give up," she would tell them, her voice still strong despite her frail body. "Our Lady hears every prayer. She knows every tear. Justice may be delayed, but it will come." When Maria passed away in 2010, her funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by her faith and compassion. Former prisoners who had found hope through the foundation, lawyers who had been inspired by her example, guards who had witnessed the miracle of that October night, all came to pay their respects to a woman who had shown them the power of unconditional love. Michael spoke at his mother's funeral, his voice breaking with emotion as he described the woman who had saved his life through her prayers. "My mother taught me that faith isn't just believing when things are good," he said. "Faith is holding on to hope when everything around you says hope is impossible." She held on for 8 years when the whole world said I was guilty. She held on when lawyers said there were no more appeals. She held on when I was hours away from execution. Because she held on, I'm standing here today. The small image of the Virgin Mary that had glowed so mysteriously was placed on Maria's casket during the service. As mourners filed past to pay their final respects, many of them touched the simple wooden frame, remembering the miracle that had changed so many lives. Father Mackenzie, now well into his 70s, delivered the homily at Maria's funeral. He spoke about the mysterious ways that grace works in the world, how one woman's prayers had set in motion a chain of events that had freed not just her son, but dozens of other innocent people. So Maria never lived to see all the lives that would be saved because of her faith, Father Mackenzie said. But I believe she knew. I believe Our Lady showed her in those final days how her prayers had created ripples that would continue spreading long after she was gone. The foundation continued to grow after Maria's death, establishing chapters in multiple states and helping to free more than 50 wrongfully convicted individuals over the next decade. Each case was different, but the pattern was always the same. Innocent people failed by a system that was supposed to protect them. Families who refused to give up hope, and dedicated advocates who believed that truth would ultimately prevail. One of the most remarkable aspects of Michael's work was how it transformed not just the lives of those who were freed, but the lives of those who helped free them. Lawyers who had become cynical about the justice system rediscovered their passion for the law. Investigators who had grown tired of dead-end cases found renewed purpose in seeking truth. Students who were considering careers in criminal justice were inspired to enter the field with a commitment to reform. The story of the glowing Virgin Mary image continued to inspire people around the world. Religious scholars studied the account, trying to understand how such a phenomenon could occur. Scientists examined similar claims, searching for natural explanations for supernatural events. Skeptics dismissed it as mass hallucination or elaborate hoax. But for those who were there that night, for those who witnessed the transformation that followed, the explanation didn't matter as much as the result. Something extraordinary had happened in that death row cell, something that had changed lives and brought justice where there had been none. The prison where Michael had been incarcerated underwent significant changes in the years following his release. New protocols were established for handling capital cases. Additional oversight was implemented to prevent the kind of corruption that had nearly cost Michael his life. The death row facility itself was eventually closed and converted into a minimum security rehabilitation center, focused on preparing inmates for successful reintegration into society. David Walsh, the guard whose confession had saved Michael's life, became one of the Foundation's most effective advocates. His transformation from hardened corrections officer to passionate reformer showed that redemption was possible for everyone, regardless of their past mistakes. Walsh traveled the country speaking about the dangers of corruption within law enforcement and the importance of speaking truth even when it came at great personal cost. "I lived with that lie for 8 years," Walsh would tell audiences, his voice still carrying the weight of his former guilt. "Every day I woke up knowing that an innocent man was going to die because of my cowardice. The miracle wasn't just that the Virgin Mary's image glowed that night. The miracle was that I finally found the courage to tell the truth." Walsh's story became particularly powerful in law enforcement circles, where his message about integrity and moral courage resonated with officers who faced their own ethical challenges. Police academies began using his testimony as part of their training programs, helping new officers understand the devastating consequences that could result from compromising their principles. The ripple effects of that miraculous October night continued to spread in ways that none of the participants could have anticipated. Legal reforms inspired by Michael's case were adopted in multiple states. Innocence projects modeled on his foundation were established across the country. The story of the glowing Virgin Mary became part of the folklore surrounding criminal justice reform, a reminder that sometimes the most profound changes begin with acts of faith rather than acts of legislation. For Michael himself, the years following his release brought a peace he had never known was possible. He married a woman named Sarah, a social worker who had become involved with the Foundation's family counseling programs. Together, they raised 2 children, a daughter named Maria in honor of his mother, and a son named Patrick, named for the officer whose death had set in motion the chain of events that defined his life. Michael made sure his children knew their grandmother's story, how her faith had literally saved their father's life. He taught them to pray the rosary as Maria had taught him, passing down the tradition of faith that had sustained their family through its darkest hours. The small image of the Virgin Mary held a place of honor in their home, a daily reminder of the miracle that had made their family possible. On quiet evenings, Michael would sometimes sit alone with the image, remembering that night when everything had seemed hopeless. He would think about the journey from that death row cell to his current life of freedom and purpose. The transformation still amazed him, not just the external changes, but the internal ones. The way suffering had been transformed into compassion, despair into hope, hatred into love. The story continued to inspire people facing their own impossible situations. Families dealing with wrongful convictions found hope in Michael's example. People struggling with loss of faith discovered renewal in his testimony. Individuals who felt abandoned by the justice system learned that truth had a way of emerging even in the darkest circumstances. 20 years after that miraculous night, Michael established a scholarship program for students pursuing careers in criminal justice reform. The Maria Carter Memorial Scholarships were awarded annually to young people who demonstrated both academic excellence and a commitment to serving justice for the most vulnerable members of society. The first recipient was a young woman whose father had been wrongfully convicted when she was a child. Like Michael, he had spent years in prison before evidence of his innocence finally emerged. Like Maria, his daughter had never stopped believing in his innocence, visiting him faithfully and praying for his freedom. During the scholarship ceremony, this young woman spoke about how Michael's story had given her family hope during their darkest days. She talked about the power of faith to sustain people through unimaginable trials, and about the responsibility that came with freedom to help others who were still trapped by injustice. The miracle of the Virgin Mary didn't end when Mr. Carter walked out of prison, she said, her voice strong with conviction. It continues every time someone refuses to give up on truth, every time someone chooses hope over despair, every time someone uses their freedom to fight for others who are still waiting for theirs. As Michael listened to her words, he felt the same presence he had experienced in that death row cell 2 decades earlier. The Virgin Mary's intercession hadn't been limited to one night, one person, one impossible situation. It was an ongoing invitation to participate in the work of redemption, to be agents of mercy in a world that desperately needed both justice and compassion. The small image that had glowed so mysteriously that October night continued to rest in its place of honor in Michael's home, a silent witness to the power of faith to transform even the most hopeless circumstances. Visitors would often ask about the miracle, wanting to understand how such a thing could happen in the modern world. Michael's answer remained consistent over the years. "I don't pretend to understand how it worked," he would say, with the same gentle smile that had characterized him since his release. "I just know that when everything seemed lost, when justice appeared impossible, when hope was nearly dead, Our Lady found a way to reach into that cell and change everything. Not just for me, but for everyone whose life was touched by what happened that night." The story Carter N. of Michael, the glowing Virgin Mary, had become more than just an account of wrongful conviction overturned or even a miraculous intervention. It had become a testament to the power of persistent faith, unwavering love, and the mysterious ways that grace can enter the world to bring about transformation that seems impossible by human standards alone. And in death row facilities across the country, in courtrooms where justice hangs in the balance, in homes where families pray for loved ones caught in the web of an imperfect system, people still tell the story of that October night when heaven touched earth in the most unlikely place, reminding everyone who hears it that no situation is beyond hope, no prayer goes unheard, and no act of faith is ever wasted. The miracle continues, spreading outward like light from that small, glowing image, touching hearts and changing lives in ways that echo through generations, proving again and again that the mercy of the Virgin Mary truly knows no limits, no walls, and no circumstances too desperate for her loving intervention. Asti of where Michael's miraculous story spread beyond prison walls and courtroom proceedings. It reached places no one had expected. Television producers called wanting to turn his experience into a movie. Publishers offered book deals promising bestseller status. Religious organizations invited him to speak at conferences around the world. But Michael found himself drawn to quieter forms of testimony. He began visiting other death row facilities, not as a celebrity or advocate, but as someone who understood the particular darkness that lived in those places. He would sit with condemned men and women, listening to their stories without judgment, offering something more precious than legal advice or false hope. He offered presence, During one such visit to a maximum security facility in another state, Michael met a man named Carlos Mendez, who was scheduled for execution in 6 weeks. Carlos had been convicted of killing a store clerk during a robbery, though like Michael, he maintained his innocence. But what struck Michael most wasn't Carlos's claims of being framed. It was the complete absence of visitors on his approved list. "Nobody comes to see you?" Michael asked during their conversation through the reinforced glass partition. Carlos shrugged, trying to mask the pain in his eyes. "My family disowned me after the conviction. Can't say I blame them. Who wants to be associated with a cop killer? But you say you didn't do it." Doesn't matter what I say. Evidence says otherwise. Jury says otherwise. Judge says otherwise. Carlos leaned back in his chair, exhaustion written across his features. "Sometimes I wonder if it would be easier to just give up, you know. Stop fighting something that can't be won." Michael recognized that look, that tone. He had worn them both during his own darkest hours on death row. The conversation continued for another hour, but it was what happened afterward that surprised everyone involved. Michael began visiting Carlos regularly, not as part of any legal strategy or innocence project, but simply as one human being reaching out to another in his final weeks. He brought books Carlos had mentioned wanting to read. He shared stories about his own time in similar circumstances. Most importantly, he brought the kind of hope that could only come from someone who had walked the same impossible path. "I don't know if your case will turn out like mine did," Michael told Carlos during one visit. "I can't promise you some miracle that will set you free, but I can promise you this: you don't have to face whatever comes next alone." During their third visit, Carlos asked about the Virgin Mary image that had supposedly glowed in Michael's cell. Media accounts had focused on the supernatural aspects of the story, but Carlos wanted to understand something deeper. "Did you really see her? I mean, not just the glowing picture, but actually see the Virgin Mary?" Michael was quiet for a long moment, remembering that night when everything had changed. "I saw her, as real as you're sitting across from me right now, and you know what she told me? She said my mother had never stopped praying for me, that the truth would come to light." "My mother's been dead for 15 years, Carlos said quietly. "Nobody's praying for me now." "That's where you're wrong," Michael replied. "I've been praying for you since the day we met. And I'm not the only one." It was true. Michael had reached out to prayer groups, churches, and individuals around the country, asking them to include Carlos in their daily prayers. He had learned from his mother's example that prayer wasn't just about asking for miracles. It was about surrounding people with love when they felt most abandoned. 3 weeks before Carlos's scheduled execution, something unexpected happened. A witness who had been afraid to come forward during the original trial finally contacted the authorities. She had seen the real killer fleeing the scene, someone who looked nothing like Carlos. Fear of retaliation had kept her silent, but watching news coverage of Michael's story had given her courage to speak. Her testimony led to a stay of execution while new evidence was reviewed. Though Carlos's case would take months to resolve, the immediate threat of death was lifted. When Michael visited him after the stay was granted, Carlos was crying. "I don't understand it," he said through tears. "I was ready to die. I had made peace with it. And now this happens." Michael smiled, thinking of his mother's words about how Our Lady never abandons her children. Sometimes grace arrives in ways we don't expect. The important thing is to be ready to receive it. Carlos's case eventually resulted in a complete exoneration when DNA evidence definitively proved his innocence. He walked out of prison 8 months after Michael first visited him. Another life saved by the ripple effects of that miraculous October night years before. Stories like Carlos's became increasingly common as Michael's quiet ministry expanded. He never advertised what he was doing, never sought publicity for these prison visits. But word spread through the network of families, lawyers, and advocates who worked within the criminal justice system. They began referring the most hopeless cases to him, people who needed more than legal assistance. They needed someone who understood. One such case involved a woman named Jennifer Torres, who had been on death row for 7 years for allegedly killing her infant son. The prosecution had argued that she suffered from postpartum depression and had shaken the baby to death. Jennifer maintained that her son had died from an undiagnosed medical condition, but multiple appeals had been unsuccessful. When Michael first met Jennifer, he was struck by her composure. Unlike many death row inmates who carried their desperation like a visible burden, Jennifer seemed almost peaceful. Their conversation, during learned why. I know I'm going to die for something I didn't do, she told him matter-of-factly. I've accepted that, but I also know that when I die, I'll be with my son again. That's all I really want now. Michael's story reminds us that miracles aren't just ancient tales from dusty books. They happen today, in the darkest places, for people who need them most. When everything seems impossible, when justice appears lost, when hope feels dead, remember that Our Lady still intercedes for those who call upon her. Her mercy knows no walls, no bars, no circumstances too desperate for divine intervention. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. And remember, no prayer ever goes unheard.